In this isolated village, people are not being murdered, something far worse is happening. Every night, a silent entity drains them of their very life, leaving behind nothing but cold, empty shells. And the sun is about to set again. 1. The terror. Death stalked through the little village of La Foubelle at the edge of the great swamp. Again and again it struck, fattening the tiny, cypress-draped graveyard until there was scarcely a house that was not in mourning. No ordinary calamity this, but a horror. Men talked of it in awed, hushed whispers. Women, hollow-eyed and gaunt from worry, pressed their little ones to their flaccid breasts as they busied themselves with their household tasks. The coming of night found the streets deserted, the townspeople huddled, white-faced and frightened, behind closed doors. La maladie sans maladie, they called it, this dark, formless, unspeakable terror that always came at night, striking down young and old alike, leaving in its wake a body shriveled and deflated, the skin puckered into 1,000 wrinkles. They had seen their loved ones die. Had these simple folk of La Foubelle seen them twist and writhe in excruciating agony at the very last? Sometimes, when the victim was very strong, the thing took toll of him for days. Jules Delatour, it was, who whimpered of having seen the horror hovering over the body of his dying mother, a black, transparent thing, he babbled, smoke-like and shapeless, its bestial face filled with malignant ferocity. But Jules was the village drunkard and had been in his cups the night his mother passed away, so no one believed his tale. Dr. Lamontagne, sipping rum from a battered tin cup and poring over a volume of Cagliostro, noted the shadow that fell across the book as a man entered the cubbyhole of an office. "Drink," he growled without looking up, and shoved a second cup across the desk. "Rum. Good Jamaica rum. Help yourself." The green and yellow parrot, swinging on its perch at his elbow, opened its filmy eyes and echoed its master's invitation. "Rum," it shrieked drowsily. "Good Jamaica rum. Hotter 'n hell. Hotter 'n hell." Lamontagne looked up when his visitor made no response to the double overture. Then he leaped to his feet, his hand outstretched, his eyes smiling a welcome under their bushy red brows. "The Dominie, by all that's holy!" he roared. He dumped a pile of magazines from a chair, kicked them into the corner, and shoved it to his guest. "No wonder you refused my invitation to guzzle," he chuckled. "You, the only teetotaler in the village. Sit down, my friend, and take a load off your feet." The schoolmaster dropped wearily into the proffered seat and gazed at his host curiously. "Will you never grow up?" he demanded whimsically. Lamontagne shrugged his shoulders and returned the other's smile with a broad grin. "I hope not," he chuckled. "The devil of it, Dominie, is that I've sipped the nectar from the cup of knowledge and now all that's left for me is the dregs. But come, my friend, what brings you, a sick man, out in the heat of the day? Have I not warned you repeatedly against it?" The little Dominie smiled wanly. "Evelyn Elbrest was stricken today," he said finally. "She is like the others." There was silence for a moment. Lamontagne wagged his big head sagely, then he drew himself into his shell of professional reserve, for he knew that Noël Pelletier loved the slip of a girl who had been his pupil. "I have already seen her," he said finally. "There is nothing that you can do for her." Again the physician was silent. Then he arose and took a short turn about the tiny room. Returning to his desk, he dropped back into his seat and, filling the tin cup from the rum jug at his elbow, he downed the contents at a gulp. "I have told you before, my friend," he said finally, "that this is a case for a priest and not a physician." The schoolmaster crossed himself. "Mon Dieu!" he exclaimed. "Then you still insist?" Lamontagne nodded. "It is a question of exorcism, not physic," he growled. "All night and all this day, when I have had the opportunity, I have pored over my books. I am more convinced now than before. Listen, my friend." He leaned across the desk and tapped the jumble of books with his long forefinger. There is much knowledge in these, he said quietly, knowledge that you men with religion in your souls will not admit. Black magic? Certainly. You say that there is no such thing. I insist that it exists today just as it did in the beginning. True, the Church has stamped it out to a large degree. But, nevertheless, there are many isolated cases, places far from the ken of men, such as here in La Faubelle, where it flourishes like the grass after a spring rain. Your people here are superstitious. They have given the devil fertile soil in which to plant his seeds. Admitted. Admitted. The little schoolmaster said excitedly. Against such ignorance one man can do nothing, a dozen could not handle the situation efficiently. Yet. Lamontagne held up a restraining hand. Books such as these of mine tell of strange, weird things, he interrupted, horrible things, things of which the average man never dreams. Our ancestors knew more about spirit life, the life beyond the veil, than we shall ever know. Why? Because they lived closer to it. I have traveled in many lands and I have studied in innumerable out-of-the-way places, he went on heatedly, but never have I seen such a rare opportunity for the devil and his imps as here in La Faubelle. And he has taken advantage of it, Dominie. There is a terrible influence at work here under our very noses. The schoolmaster crossed himself again. Disorient! He exclaimed with a shudder. Do you mean that there are many things the average man cannot, will not understand? Lamontagne interrupted. There are innumerable forms of spirit life, forms that function in various ways. Some of them, most of them, I might say, are kindly disposed toward us. Others are malignant. We have to deal with one of the latter in this case. He filled and lighted his pipe, the little schoolmaster gazing at him with eyes that betrayed his horror and astonishment. Disorient! He said again. You are beyond my depth, my friend. Explain yourself. Lamontagne scratched his red beard reflectively. Primal earth forces, he said shortly, elemental spirit forms that have never evolved subhuman nature spirits. They exist, together with innumerable other spirit forms, on the other side of the veil. Mon Dieu! The schoolmaster gasped. I can hardly believe it, my Dr. Eyre. These things are jealous of mankind, hating living beings because mankind has evolved, Lamontagne went on. Why? Because they have never developed beyond the rudimentary stages. Consequently, they consider mankind their natural prey. One of these things is loose in our peaceful little village. Because it is out of its natural habitat, it must have vitality on which to live, human vitality. Otherwise, it ceases to be. So it feeds upon the vitality of those with whom it comes in contact, just as a vampire feeds upon human blood. The face of the little schoolmaster turned a ghastly white. He half rose from his chair, then dropped back again, his teeth chattering. Horrible! Horrible! Blasphemous! He ejaculated. Lamontagne shrugged his broad shoulders. In order to obtain this sustenance, this vitality, to prolong its existence, he continued, an elemental must, necessarily, in its early stages, prey largely upon the sick, the weak, those who are at a low physical stage. But eventually it satiates itself with their vitality and becomes stronger. Then it seeks its victims among the more powerful. That is the cause of this plague among the members of our community. The schoolmaster leaned back in his chair, his thin face drawn and haggard. Vieux avec nous, he said in a low, awed whisper. Then Jules Delatour told the truth. And it is this horrible thing that my little Evelyn is faced with, my Dr. Eyre? Is there nothing that we can do to combat it? Lamontagne patted the pile of books in front of him, his eyes wearing a strange, far-away look. That is what I have been studying, he said finally. But, first, let us consider how this unholy thing chanced to come to us. There must be a reason. What caused it to break through the veil? The schoolmaster's hands trembled like those of a man with the ague. Explain, he said hoarsely. Alone and unassisted, These primal forces cannot come to us, Lamontagne told him. They must be aided by someone who is already here, someone who has the vitality to support them for the nonce. It must be one with mediumistic powers. Now do you understand? The little schoolmaster crossed himself again. It is unbelievable, horrible, he said. Then, leaning forward, his voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. I would willingly give my life, Dr. Eyre, in order to save the woman I love. You, who know everything, perhaps can show me the way. Lamontagne combed his long beard with his fingers, reflectively. My books have already told me that much, he said after a brief pause. If you care to take the chance. The other nodded, a hectic spot appearing in each cheek. Proceed, he commanded hoarsely. Lamontagne rose and, walking to the little medicine cabinet, filled a hypodermic with clear, colorless liquid. An injection of this liquid will lower your vitality to a point where you will be an easy victim, he said quietly, far easier than Evelyn, who is strong and healthy and able to resist it. Why? Because you are already a sick man. I have a plan to trap this thing. It must be a secret between us if you are willing to trust me and take the only way out. For an instant there was silence. Then the little schoolmaster bared his frail arm to the needle. To the thing. Rum-guzzler though he was, a soldier of fortune, a wild, barbaric throwback, born 100 years too late, Dr. Hugo Lamontagne was yet an occultist of international reputation and a physician of extraordinary ability. Possessed of a fortune which made him independent of his fellow men, he followed the dictates of his own conscience, caring not a whit for the conventions. To him the esoteric practices of voodoo, obeah, and demonology were open books. To study them he had followed his beard to the end of the world. Tall and broad-shouldered, his hair as red as the blood that he had shed on a dozen foreign fields, possessing the whiskers of a Viking, slovenly in his attire, constantly spoiling for a fight or a frolic, he was a man to be reckoned with under any conditions. His insatiable craving for knowledge had brought him to the little village of La Foubelle. Slumbering at the very edge of the gigantic morass, uncontaminated by the presence of outsiders, its French Creole inhabitants had clung, leech-like, to the customs and superstitions of their ancestors. Close association with the blacks who, brought from West India as slaves at an early day, had revolted and fled to the interior of the swamp, had intensified these weird beliefs. La Foubelle was a virgin vein of folklore and heterodoxies, witchcraft, and bizarre customs. Lamontagne had deliberately thrown himself into the midst of the lives of these near barbarians. He had ingratiated himself to them and, by degrees, had been accepted as one of them. Eventually he had become not only their physician, but their confessor as well. The day had brought more than its accustomed load of suffering. The heat had made the afflicted ones worse. Making his evening rounds, Lamontagne was filled with a premonition of death lurking close at hand. He had the narrow street to himself. Men and women talked in low, hushed whispers, huddling together, sheep-like, fearful of the darkness that had dropped like a pall. Frightened children clung to their mothers' skirts, their black eyes beady with terror. From inside a tiny cottage came the sound of muffled sobs as a young mother rocked her firstborn, slowly wasting away. The bell in the little schoolhouse at the end of the lane clanged dolefully. Lamontagne halted in his tracks, his broad shoulders drooping like those of a defeated man. For the schoolhouse was also the church. Bong! 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 He counted the strokes. When they passed 16, he breathed a deep sigh of relief. It meant that little Evelyn Elbrest was not the victim. Bong! 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 He counted on until the strokes passed 50. Then, as they continued their doleful monoi, he lifted his shoulders and took up his walk again. It would be old Kenny Tolan, he told himself. Kenny Tolan, 82 and long ago marked as a victim by the Grim Reaper. And deep in his pagan heart, Dr. Hugo Lamontagne breathed a little prayer of thanksgiving. Evelyn Elbrest, the schoolmaster's sweetheart, still lived. There was yet a chance. Again he was halted by an agonized scream. It came from a cottage close at hand, the abode of Jacques Darcy, at the end of the side road. He whirled and dashed through the darkness in the direction of the low, thatched house with its single lighted window. A white, scared face stared at him through the darkness as a man rushed around the corner, his gun drawn, almost colliding with him in his mad rush. It was Pierre L'Effronte, the village constable. Mon Dieu! The little man exclaimed. You heard it, Dr. Eyre. Lamontagne nodded grimly. The constable by his side, he padded noiselessly over the soft earth between the rows of trees, covered with Spanish moss, that led to the Darcy home. A man dashed toward them from the direction of the house. He saw them and, whirling, leaped into the thicket that banked the roadside. As he disappeared, he turned. Even though the moon was dead in the leaden sky, Lamontagne caught a glimpse of a lean, cadaverous face, of teeth over which the lips were drawn in a wolfish snarl, of deeply sunken eyes that glittered ominously. The big physician seized the little constable by the shoulder, halting him with a violence that almost jerked him off his feet. Your gun. Quick! He snarled. He jerked the weapon from the officer's hand and emptied it in the direction the fleeing man had taken. Then, dropping it at the astonished constable's feet, he dashed madly in the same direction. L'Effronte followed. He heard Lamontagne crash through the dank grass and underbrush that bordered the fetid swamp. Then came the sound of a bateau as it swung out into the water, the creak of oars in their locks. Lamontagne, his feet bogged by the mud, met the little man as he struggled through the tangled growth, and cursed fluently. Mon Dieu! The constable panted. Who was it? And what happened? It was Aaron Cronk. Lamontagne snarled. From far out in the fetid waters of the swamp came a harsh, sinister laugh. Constable L'Effronte dropped to his knees and crossed himself. Aaron Cronk. Little wonder Pierre L'Effronte turned a shade paler under his coating of tan. Aaron Cronk. Master of diablerie and king of devils. He it was who, only a few weeks earlier, masquerading as the infamous Gilles de Laval, Baron de Retz, the blue-bearded monster of the Middle Ages, had involved himself in a saturnalia of blood from which only the bravery and occult knowledge of Lamontagne had rescued the community. Even now, two of his intended victims were in the hospital at New Orleans recovering from their injuries. The old house on the peninsula where he had made his headquarters was a mass of charred embers and smoke-stained masonry. They hurried back toward the house of Jacques Darcy. Once more the wild shrieks assailed their ears, speeding their footsteps. Mingled with the screams was a low, gurgling moaning. It grew fainter as they approached. By the time they reached the low, whitewashed gate, it had ceased. The front door was thrown hurriedly open and a white face peered out at them, terror written in every lineament. In a rustic wicker chair in the low-ceilinged room an old woman was weaving backward and forward, shrieking hysterically. Around her stood three other women, two of them neighbors, one a daughter. A fourth had opened the door. They greeted the newcomers with gasps of relief. On connaît l'ami au besoin, a friend is known in time of need. The younger woman exclaimed. Eetse Dr. Eyre. Lamontagne seized her by the shoulder. What happened? He snapped. She twisted her tattered handkerchief about her fingers nervously. That I do not rightly know, she finally managed to ejaculate. Pierre Darcy, he is dying, we think. We were with him. We hear a noise outside. We look through the window. There was a face peering in at us, a horrible face, Dr. Eyre. It was the face of Le Diable. She stopped, shuddering like one who suffers from the ague. Lamontagne glared at her and she continued. We scream. Then the awful face disappear and through the window comes the shapeless shape. Like a goes it was with so form, yet it had the form. I cannot explain it, Dr. Eyre. She broke off her recital and gave way to shuddering sobs, her face buried in her hands. Lamontagne seized her by the shoulder again and shook her roughly. The old woman recommenced her hysterical howling. "Talk!" Lamontagne snapped, shaking the woman until her teeth chattered. "Time is of value now. Talk!" The woman ceased her convulsive sobbing and looked at the big physician pathetically. "It was awful horrible," she said finally. "Père Darcy," he gives a wild scream. "Ze thing, ze awful thing drop upon him like ze great veil. Jacques," he moan again and again. "Zen, ze moan, too, stop. We have rush out and we are here. We are afraid of ze thing. Zen you come." Lamontagne shoved her aside and, darting to the door of the sick room, seized the knob and jerked it open. The room was in darkness, yet the light, shining through the open door from the outer room, was strong enough to reveal the scene that was being enacted. Even Lamontagne, inured though he was to death and violence, shrank back. Old Jacques Darcy lay upon the floor by the side of the bed. His face, glaring up at them, was twisted into a horrible contortion, the eyes protruding as if they had been squeezed from their sockets. His body was shriveled into a million wrinkles, it was like a toy balloon that has been deflated. Over the dead man was a form a strange, gossamer-like wraith, vague, shadowy, indistinct. The physician had an impression of malignant eyes glaring at him, of a slit of a mouth drawn back into a wolfish snarl. Yet there were no eyes, no mouth. The thing was shapeless. Recovering himself, Lamontagne took a step forward. The hellish thing seemed about to spring at him. Then it drew back as if reluctant to leave the body of its victim. Slowly it dissolved itself, floating away like a bit of vapor, through the open window. Lamontagne turned to the others who stood shuddering in the doorway. The old woman took up her hysterical wailing again. A faint odor filled the room. It was strange, indistinguishable, horrible, nauseating. It was the odor of death. The thing from beyond, gorged with vitality, had reached a point in its development where it was visible to human eyes. 3 out of the night. It was apparent to Lamontagne that Aaron Cronk was the medium by which the horrific spirit form from the other world had been materialized. Yet the burly physician was puzzled. What sinister motive did the diabolical Cronk have in thus wreaking his vengeance upon the inoffensive, simple-minded inhabitants of the sleepy little village? They had done him no harm. Until a few weeks earlier, when Lamontagne had met and bested him in his struggle for the de Laval fortune, these people had never known of his existence. Yet in Lamontagne's mind there was no doubt that Cronk was possessed of more than ordinary mediumistic ability, and that it was through him that the terrible primal force had been developed. But why? He asked himself the question 100 times as he completed his rounds of the sick, following the horrible death of Jacques Darcy. It was late when he had finished. Now, even though it was well past midnight, he still sat in his darkened office, his feet upon the desk, his eyes, half closed, gazing out of the open window. He had kicked off his shoes and thrust his toes into carpet slippers. His shirt was tossed carelessly into the corner and his suspenders hung down over his hips. The little village had long since quieted down for the night. Here and there a dim light glimmered in a curtained window, marking the home of some helpless victim who was fighting the horror that was hovering over the peaceful little hamlet like a great pall, a horror that he, the man in whom these simple village folk had learned to place their trust, was unable to combat. Lamontagne cursed aloud as he realized the futility of his struggle against the thing from beyond. He had found in his books no surcease of sorrow, no way to scotch the demon. It was something that he must think out, reason out for himself. His only chance lay in the trap he had laid by means of the little schoolmaster. Had he done right in thus exposing Noël Pelletier to the terrible danger? There was no other way. He consoled himself with the thought that Pelletier had no desire to live if Evelyn Elbrest died. And unless he was successful in his assault on the malevolent spirit through the little Dominie, Evelyn Elbrest must surely go. And yet he had no set plan. He was trusting to luck, blind luck, hoping against hope that he would succeed. There was a light footstep on the gravel outside the window. He looked out. It was Pierre L'Effronte, the constable, making his midnight rounds. Seeing the physician sitting in the open window, he had entered the yard. Now, at Lamontaine's invitation, he stepped inside. The physician picked the rum jug from the floor and, filling a cup for himself, tossed another across the desk to the officer and jerked his thumb toward the jug. "Drink," he growled. "Jamaica rum. It'll do you good on a night like this, a night when the very atmosphere tingles with death." "Mon Dieu. Yes, yes," L'Effronte ejaculated. "I, too, feel in the air, Dr. Air." He filled the cup and tossed off the contents with an appreciative smack of his lips. "Ze domini es worse," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I am gozier and stay ze night with him when I finish my round. He es fear to stay alone." Lamontaine cursed again full, man-sized oaths. "And there's not a damned thing that I can do," he mourned. "Not a damned thing." L'Effronte leaned forward, the better to see through the darkness the face of the man on the other side of the desk. "Zen es true, zat wick ze domini whisper to me zat ze thing wick we see a while ago at Darcy's es not a ghost zat never lived like you and me." For a moment Lamontaine made no answer. Then he nodded solemnly. "True," he answered finally. "And the thing that's agitating my mind, my friend, is the reason for all this. Why should Kronk wreak such diabolical vengeance upon this little village?" L'Effronte helped himself to the rum. Then, as the fiery liquor raced through his veins, he grew more loquacious. "I think I know," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He leaned forward and poured forth his story to Dr. Lamontaine. The big man listened quietly, then, when L'Effronte had finished, he burst forth. "May a just God burn his damned soul in hell," he snarled. "God. L'Effronte. Can a man be so cold-blooded for the sake of gold?" "Zat es my opinion," the constable said earnestly. "I half reason it out in my head." Lamontaine wagged his long red beard solemnly. That for which he had been groping for so long was gradually filtering through his brain. He was beginning to see a bright and shining light. "In the morning I will go to N Orleans and look into that," he promised. The little constable nodded and, helping himself to the rum again, left to take up his lonely vigil in the bachelor quarters of the schoolmaster. Neither of them noticed the sinister figure that had been standing in the darkness close beside the open window listening to their conversation. Now, as the constable left, he darted to the shadow of a nearby bush, his sunken eyes gleaming malevolently at the big man who sat just inside the window, his long beard resting on his breast, his head bowed in thought. It was Aaron Kronk. To be continued.